Did you know that there's a sim racing game out there that's free to enter, doesn't require a super powerful beefy PC to play smoothly, and contains some of the most incredible and evocative car and track content from the history of motorsport? And it's just about to receive an update. And it's going to be epic. And I get to try it. The game I'm talking about is, of course, RaceRoom, because on the 4th of September, there's going to be an update, and it's going to be a fairly major one. We're going to have some incredibly exciting new content coming to the platform, and a bunch of other transformative changes that are hopefully going to improve the overall experience. Now, some of this content, by the way, includes circuits that I don't think I've ever seen before in official capacity on a sim racing title, so that is always very, very exciting. And I have to say a big thank you to RaceRoom for obviously giving me the keys to this update nice and early so I can bring you this video. But what is it about this update that makes it so significant? Well, first of all, content aside, there's been a major visual overhaul with improved graphics and improved performance. Here's a side-by-side comparison of the existing version and the new updated version, and as you can see, there are notable differences. I think the lighting, the reflections, the clouds, of which there are now specific options for, by the way, and the colours are probably the biggest changes, but there are also tweaks to the motion blur, the shadows, the depth of field, and much, much more. For me, having tested back-to-back, is certainly a positive step. Performance-based improvements have been made as well, increasing frame rates, although since I'm using a pretty high-spec PC, this isn't really something I've been able to notice. I'm not going to go into every detail in this video, but if you want to know the specifics, make sure you head over to the TraxionGG website, where there'll be a full article covering the graphical changes specifically. But it's the new old content that, as a massive motorsport fan, just gets me the most excited. Now this year, the DTM celebrates its 40th anniversary, and obviously if you've been paying any attention to RaceRoom over the years, you'll know that RaceRoom have an official partnership with the DTM, so there's always DTM content on there, both new and old stuff as well. And what they're doing is they're adding a new pack to the list, DTM 1995. Now we already had the Mercedes C-Class from the DTM in 1995 on the platform, but what they're doing is adding the incredible Alfa Romeo 155 V6 TI, and then this, which is the four-wheel drive Opel Calibra. And you might be surprised to hear that despite these cars being based on bog-standard production cars, they're arguably more complex than Formula 1 cars of the same era. In the early 90s, touring car racing was split into two different FIA regulation sets. These were Class 2, which would go on to be known as Super Touring, and Class 1. Class 2 cars were limited to a 2-litre engine, producing around about 300 brake horsepower, and were closer aerodynamically to their production-based counterparts. Mad to think, Super Tourers were actually the slower, more affordable class of touring car racing, but that's a big part of the problem that we'll get to later. Class 1, on the other hand, were the bigger, bolder, more premium sibling. Let's call them Super Duper Tourers. These cars all had 2.5-litre naturally aspirated V6 engines, which is why they sound so incredible. Power output was anywhere between 400 and 500 brake horsepower, depending on the year and of course the team specifically. Now this Phase 4 Opel Calibra, which is the 1995 car that I'm driving right now, had around about 470 brake horsepower from its Cosworth engine. Because these regulations were viewed as the premium touring car offering, there was plenty of freedom for manufacturers to do pretty much whatever they wanted to. So if you wanted ABS and traction control, you could have it. And they did. And if you wanted all-wheel drive, you could have that as well. So Alfa Romeo, who I'll get to shortly, and Opel both went down that route too. You could also go wild with your aerodynamics, so long as it was below the centerline of the wheel. And with all the other space-age technology that these things had, you can understand how they are as quick as they are. I mean, they had traction control, they had anti-lock brakes, incredible aerodynamics. In fact, eventually they would have active aerodynamics, although that wouldn't come in until 1996. The works. These cars had everything, and they were just magical. The Calibra wasn't introduced until the 10th round of the 1993 season, which was of course the first for these regulations, but it was being developed and run by Jost Racing. That is of course Reinhold Jost's team, the same one that dominated Le Mans in the late 90s and through the 2000s with Audi. So even though they were a bit late to the party, as you can probably imagine, it didn't take them too long to catch up. The Calibras also had a bit of a special place in my heart personally as well, because the last sports car my grandpa ever owned was a V6 Calibra, So when I was about 5 years old, I was getting rides in this thing. And okay, it didn't have 470 horsepower, but it was such a cool car. So there'll always be, for me, just that bit of attachment there for this particular car. I do wish I'd seen it racing, period. A quick interruption to bring you some traction related news. Now this video is sponsored by our good friends over at GridFinder, and they're actually hosting a traction themed livery design competition that you can enter. There are no eligibility criteria, it is totally free, you can get involved, there are some really cool prizes up for grabs as well, there's some cash, there's some traction themed gloves like these. So it's all very cool. Myself and my traction colleagues will also be making up the judging panel and deciding which of the liveries is our favourite. So for more information to find out how to get involved and what it entails, make sure you head to the link in the description below, which will take you to the article on the TraxionGG website, and also head to gridfinder.com as well, because that's where you'll have to go to enter the competition. Back to the video. Now you may or may not have noticed by this point that I'm actually lapping the car around a circuit that's brand new to RaceRoom. Now you may or may not recognise it. If you do, mega. If you don't, well, I don't really blame you, because there's been no racing taking place around this circuit in this century. Because what we have here is the mid-90s version, and there are two versions in RaceRoom now, of Avus, or Avus. Now despite its simple layout, this track is steeped in history, and you might think it's a bit of a weird layout. I mean, you've got this incredibly tight hairpin to start the lap, which you actually need a steering rack or steering ratio of about 20 on this game just to get round. You've then got this quick right, left, right chicane. You try and get as close to the curbs as possible without hitting them, get close to the wall on the exit. Into a flat out right kink. And then into the north curve at the top, which is long, sweeping, you gotta wait to put the power down. And then back onto the pit straight. So there's really not much to it. But the thing is, there used to be even less to it. It used to be much weirder. This track, situated on the outskirts of Berlin, opened over a century ago and was originally more than 12 miles long. As well as a racing venue, it was built as an automotive testing venue, with two 6-mile straights running parallel, joined by north and south hairpins. So essentially, two mental drag strips that lasted over a minute each, bookended by some prayers that your brakes were actually going to work. Doesn't sound like my idea of fun, to be honest. And then this north corner here, in the mid-1930s, got turned into a banking. And I'm not talking about any old banking, I mean like a big one. 40 degrees plus, huge speeds, and interestingly no barrier or railing or wall at the top to stop people going over the other end. So with all of that in mind, it's maybe not a major surprise that they ditched the banking in the late 60s, you know, when safety began to actually mean something. And they've continued to make changes to this circuit ever since. They kept moving the south hairpin further and further north, just to make it a little bit shorter, because racetracks didn't have massive long straights anymore. Then obviously they added that chicane in the early 90s as well to slow down the speeds on the back straight. But even with all of that, this was still a mega dangerous circuit. When DTM, ITC and Super Tourers were racing here in the 90s, we saw some major accidents. John Winter had his fiery crash in his Calibra, like this one actually, in 1994. And then a year later in 1995, Keith Adore was racing in the German Super Tourers Championship. He had a big crash on the right-hand kink, the one that I'm coming up to right now, and unfortunately was blindsided by Frank Biela in his Audi, and Keith lost his life. The venue would eventually close just before the turn of the new millennium, and that is why I'm so happy to see it in RaceRoom, because it's a track that no longer exists, full of history, that's essentially been preserved, at least in its 90s form, both the 94 layout and the 98 layout. And that just makes me happy. It means in an official capacity we can continue to race around this place for years to come. And amazingly, it's not the only circuit that comes as part of this new update to tick that very box. Because this is Diepholz. Not quite as vibrant a history as Avus as a circuit. I mean, it's a temporary facility built on an airstrip, like many other circuits of course. But much like Avus, it also held its final race in 1998 and was a staple of the DTM and ITC championships, DTM of course being the German rounds, in the mid-90s. So perfect for cars like these, and like Avus, it's been preserved in RaceRoom, which is just great. I didn't know much about this circuit, to be honest. I mean, I didn't know it very well by name, but as soon as I started playing it, I recognized where I was. Of course, there are certain elements to this circuit that you may have seen clips from before. Obviously, the big curbs everywhere, sending these cars up in the air, creating lots of sparks. That's lots of footage we've seen on YouTube before, lots of footage you would have seen if you were watching these races back in the 90s. There's also a very famous incident with Gabriele Tarquini in the Alfa, flying over one of the curbs, getting it wrong, and crashing into the Armco barrier. It was very dramatic, but it's just one of those sights that people seem to know from the mid-90s DTM era. And you know what? It is a fun circuit. I actually think it's got a really nice flow to it. The trickiest thing is probably the reference points. Like, it's very hard to spot your braking, because there's just not much to go on, but I mean, I love these wide airstrips. It's got its own unique character for being something that shouldn't really have character. I don't know, they've just done something really well with the layout. And there's lots of different lines you can take around the corners. The corners are very wide, which again is a trait that you can associate with tracks, you know, like this one. Cleveland springs to mind as well in the US. But it's really, really tricky. The thing is that once you get into the flow with it and begin to learn, you know, where your braking points are, where you can turn in, how much curbs you can use, not that much. It really does become enjoyable. It really does feel fitting to be throwing this 155 around here. This is the Tarquini corner. Get it in. Too much curb, two wheels. Excellent.
Alfa Romeo were the first manufacturer to nail the Class 1 rule set back in '93, and this car became an icon because of it. A carbon fibre body, Alfa's very own 2.5 litre V6, bursting eardrums from miles. An all-wheel drive system based on that of a Lancia Delta Integrale. Not bad for pedigree.
And this would deliver power in a really interesting way. It wasn't just linear, equal power across all four wheels. It actually delivered around about 60% of the horsepower to the rear wheels, and about 40% to the front, give or take. So it just meant that obviously you're putting more weight towards the back. It just works better for a circuit racing format. Now the 1995 version of the car, again, which is of course the one I'm driving now, the one in this pack, had a few more toys than the original 93 version, but not as much as the 96 version. So by this point you did have proper racing suspension. It was actually, F1 derived inbound suspension. So again, just huge technology involved in these cars. You also had adjustable anti-roll bars on the fly that the drivers could use, and all of these sorts of things to make it competitive. So many great sounds. I mean, really, what an epic era this was. I mean, categorically, albeit not for a long time, the pinnacle of tin-top racing, for sure. In many ways, I guess it was the precursor to GT1s, because yes, these are only touring cars, but the speed, the energy, the noise, the pushing the boundaries, I guess, the expenditure, all has very much GT1 vibes to it. And obviously some of these manufacturers, like Mercedes, went on to build GT1 cars, so they probably learnt a lot of stuff from the DTM as well. And then of course you had the series that was actually racing these cars. I mean, the driver roster was insane at the time. You had Formula 1 drivers of the past, you know, Keke Rosberg, who was a champion, you had Michele Alboreto, who was almost a champion, Stefano Modena, all sorts of familiar names competing. And then you had the young up-and-coming drivers as well, you know, Giancarlo Fisichella, Dario Franchitti, of course, all taking part in DTM in this era before they kind of had their big break. In fact, this was probably the ultimate stepping stone. This was the last stage before they reached the peak of their career. And then you had all sorts of other legends of sports cars, touring cars of Germany. Bernd Schneider, Uwe Altzen, Bernd Maylander, Hans Stuck, Klaus Ludwig. And then Alfa Romeo had Alessandro Nannini, Nicola Larini, Gabriele Tarquini, Fabrizio Giovanardi, Simoni, I can't drive. Even Marco Alain got involved. Right, we're going full Tarquini here. Commitment. Yes. It's so Moorish. Come on. Ah. Look at it. It's stunning. And I get to look at an Alfa now. Oh, Martini one as well. Someone's going to have to drag me off this.
Alfa Romeo had the same problem as Opel, however. In this particular year, 1995, they just couldn't compete with the might of Mercedes. Reliable, fast, and brimmed with innovation, their C-Class carried Bernd Schneider to a dominant championship victory.
Now, to give you an idea of just how advanced this car was, Mercedes developed a system that I'm going to call active ballast. I don't know what they actually called it at the time, but essentially, when a racing car is built, it's built to be as light as possible, but usually there's regulations that mean it has to weigh a certain amount. So what you do is you build the car lighter than you need to, and then you add ballast. Now what Mercedes did was essentially add ballast that could be moved on the fly. So they put it in the doors, and it was on an axis, which meant it could slide forwards and backwards, depending on whereabouts on circuit you were. So if you're heading into a braking zone or turning into a corner, it's going to be all the way to the front to keep the weight over the front tyres, to improve stability, braking, and also turning. And then under acceleration, the ballast would move to the back of the car to improve traction, because of course this car, unlike the other two, was only rear-wheel drive. They also had the gearbox mounted at the rear as well to help with that weight distribution. It was just a technical marvel, this car. I mean, it probably cost an absolute fortune to develop. But, I mean, it's just genius. I told you these things were space age. Now this car, unlike the other two, has actually been in RaceRoom for some time, but it will of course form part of the DTM 95 pack, so all three cars will be in that pack. And the pack, by the way, is going to cost you €10.99. I'm not sure in the conversion rate yet, because this is obviously pre-launch, but hopefully you'll be able to work it out. And that is for just the three cars, I should say, as well. The tracks are going to be separate, and they're €6.99 each. Now, those of you who are extra vigilant will probably have noticed that I'm no longer driving around an old airfield. I'm instead driving through some quite famous forests in Rhine Valley. Because this is yet another classic German track that the DTM used to race at that's being added as part of this update. Although this one probably needs less of an introduction than the other two, let's be honest. It is, of course, classic Hockenheimring, and this isn't the first time it's appeared in a sim. We've seen it in many sims before, but to have this pairing of these classic German tracks and these classic German cars that raced on them, I've used the word so many times, but it's just magical. It's just such a great shame that with all of this tech and noise and energy, the cars became too expensive and the whole thing was unsustainable. I mean, it's obviously a shame. It's not massively surprising. I mean, when you think about the fact that the Super Tourers, which were meant to be the cheaper, more production-based alternatives, also quickly became far too expensive and could no longer be maintained. I mean, it doesn't come as a big shock, but it completely killed the DTM series for a few years. 1996 was the last year, and then we had a 3 or 4 year hiatus before it came back in the 2000s. And weirdly, DTM didn't quite learn their lesson, because this whole thing has sort of repeated itself recently. Ironically, with Class 1 regulations yet again being the problem. You may be familiar with the BMW M4 Class 1 that was available on R Factor 2 in the last few years, but it was a car that was never raced, because just as those regulations were, I guess, being stabilised or being built upon, because the cars were like that for the years leading up to that, the DTM couldn't be sustained with that formula. It was too expensive. Manufacturers weren't investing in it, so they switched to GT3s instead, just to survive. But obviously, just like so many motorsport categories where rule sets are extreme and unsustainable, at least for a very short amount of time, it gives manufacturers the chance to build incredible machines. It gives them an excuse to just run wild, and we get things like this. You know, without these crazy rule sets that don't make any sense, what cars would we have that just give us instant goosebumps as soon as we, fire them up and drive them on a sim, or watch an old video of them lapping around a circuit or racing? I think if you had to describe this car and this era in one sentence, it would just be goosebumps at the drop of a hat.
Providing us sim racers with a taste of these extraordinary, esoteric machines, whether it's 90s DTM or other old prototypes and GTs, has to be one of RaceRoom's biggest victories. In these sorts of titles, categories like GT3 are ubiquitous, and I feel like LMDH and hypercars are slowly becoming the new GT3 in that sense. But as great as all of that is, sometimes we just want something different, and this update gives us just another measure of exactly that.
I guess if modern GT3s are more your cup of tea, however, it would be remiss of me not to talk about this. Because what we have here is another part of the update. For €19.99, you can get yourself the DTM 2024 pack. Now, RaceRoom has had season packs for DTM for a number of years now, so it's nothing new in that sense, nothing different, except this time is the first time we'll ever see a full roster of cars and liveries from the actual season in the game. And that is mainly because of the addition of this, which is the Lamborghini Huracán GT3 Evo 2, and it is the first time Lamborghini has ever appeared in RaceRoom as a manufacturer. There is also a new McLaren as well, the 720S Evo. I mean, the game already had the 720S, so I guess if you're someone that gets excited about small tweaks, then unfair not to mention that too. But yeah, I mean, it's great amidst all of the competition in terms of the GT3 stuff that RaceRoom are pumping out not only classic content for the nostalgia, got a Lamborghini trying to dive down the inside, but also obviously keeping up with the contemporary stuff as well. So yeah, well done RaceRoom for hanging on. Whoa! So let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. What do you think of this update? Which of these 3 DTM cars from 1995 is your personal favourite? Which of the 3 circuits will you be jumping on first? And as I've already said, for more info on all of this stuff, especially around when it's released, please do check out the TraxionGG website, because you'll be able to find out everything you need to know about this update. And of course, if you want to see more videos like this one in the future on the YouTube channel, do hit subscribe, and of course, hit the notification bell so that you don't miss any of our future uploads. Now, I'm looking at that Calibra and I'm getting a bit jealous, so I'm going to jump back in the Calibra now and probably do another race around Diepholz. So until next time, thank you so much for watching and have a great day.